Welcome to this webinar on business environment reform in fragile and conflict-affected situations, organized by the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development and more specifically, the Working Group on Business Environment Reform. I'm Séverine Debos. I work for the ILO, and I will have the pleasure to facilitate the webinar today and to moderate the interesting and very exciting exchange that we will have with the presenters and of course with you all participants. I would like first to share some few housekeeping rules, and very few, because I think we all get used to these webinars. In case you have a question that you would like to raise, either as a comment or directly to some of the presenters, we will take them after the presentation, unless it's a very burning issue and question for clarification on one of the presentation, and so that our speakers can then address the questions during the time for discussion and exchange. And in case you have a question, please introduce yourself also in written form in the Q&A facility, and if we have the possibility to take live question, we will also do that. And in that case, we will of course give you the possibility to unmute your microphone. I think that's it for the housekeeping rule, and I would like now to go into the main content of this webinar. So why this webinar? Certainly, we all face and we saw how fragility is one of the main factors of our world today. And fragility means that countries that sometimes need private investment and economic growth are the most difficult to invest and to do business in. So not only business in these countries struggle to access markets and obtain the inputs that they require, but their governments are also challenged in their efforts to manage the business environment and to reform the economy. As a result, we see obviously unemployment, poverty, and what we can consider as the vicious circle of poverty. From my end at the ILO, I'm very excited for this webinar because also for us, business environment reform and fragility has been quite a new area of activities. And we saw increasing demand in countries that want to already think about more medium to long-term reform while already building back their economies. And the current context with obviously the COVID-19 pandemics and the series of these webinars on building back better was a perfect fit and an opportunity to present one of the recent outputs of the Business Environment Working Group in the Donor Committee on Enterprise Development. How the discussion will be organized today. We will first start with a presentation of this very recent report on business environment in fragile and complex and fragile and conflict-affected setting. And Simon White, who is the author, will share the main finding of this report. And then this will be followed up by presentations of two country case studies, one in Iraq by the GIZ and one in Afghanistan by the World Bank. And I will tell you more on these case studies as we are approaching their presentations. So let us start, right? And let us start with the presentation by Simon White. And I'm not sure I should still present Simon White, who is for the Donor Committee and especially for the Working Group, a very familiar character and face. Now we can see your face, Simon. But Simon is an independent policy advisor who helps government, business organizations, and development agencies to formulate and implement strategies for economic growth, business development, and job creation. He's a specialist in private sector development with specific expertise in business environment and investment climate reform. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Séverine, and hi, everybody. I hope you're all well. So it's a great pleasure to be able to present the highlights of this report, which, as Séverine has said, was done around about 18 months ago. And as with many of the documents of the DCED, it's very much focused on the role of donor and development agencies in supporting business environment reform in fragile and conflict-affected situations. In this case, it was a review of documents and programs and projects that donors had supported, as well as about 15 different agencies were interviewed in terms of their experiences in designing and managing and reporting on these programs. So I'm just going to go through fairly quickly some of the sort of highlights of this. I think initially it's important to say that the framing of this work was very much around recognizing that a lot of the initial work being done in fragile and conflict-affected situations is emergency relief and dealing with the crisis at hand. And here we start then to move to this nexus or intersection between that kind of emergency work and humanitarian work and then transitional development assistance. And so the question has been, within that context of this shift from the humanitarian through to the transitional assistance, what role does firstly private sector development play, and within that business environment reform, which we're really seeing as a subsector of the private sector work. So that was the way in which we framed this and tried to look at where are these connections being forged. So how can private sector development programs build on humanitarian assistance and begin to introduce the concepts of or the approaches to business environment reform? Next slide, please. So in this, we firstly, of course, recognize the role of the private sector, that the private sector has incredible potential to foster stability, peace, social cohesion. It, of course, generates income, it creates jobs, provides local services and products, and these kind of issues that are all important. But we also recognize that the private sector can equally contribute to unrest and fragility and conflict and increase competition over scarce resources. So it's not always sort of benign in this sense that the private sector can contribute to conflict and fragility just as much as it can help support stabilization and peace, etc. So we sort of going into this recognizing we're not saying everything about the private sector is perfect, but there is a way in which there is elements of the private sector we want to build, and we want to really focus on those areas. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move ahead. So private sector development programming, what we found in general, in most countries, is evaluated from an economic perspective, particularly or including in fragile and conflict-affected situations, where the issues are about incomes and jobs and profits and investments. And this is typically how we would frame how well our PSD program is going. In doing that, though, very little attention is being given to, is this programming actually contributing to stabilization and to peace and social cohesion, etc. So what we find is, even though it's being used as a tool with that justification, these issues aren't always being monitored, these issues aren't always being evaluated within the programs. So we know there is a connection between private sector development, economic development, and these other benefits, but where are the causal links? And we need to better understand that. Thank you. Next slide, please. So within this context, we're often asking, what are the minimal requirements? When should a donor agency and its program partners start thinking about introducing private sector development, and in particular business environment reform? And here we found that there was often a distinction that agencies made between working on conflict issues and working in conflict issues. So of course, when working in a conflict issues, there are a range of issues related to the safety of workers, the safety of program partners, the feasibility of doing dialogue and all these kind of issues. There are a lot of issues around, can we work in these environments in the first place? On the other hand, it's when we're working on conflict, we're thinking about what role, what contribution can business environment reform bring to contributing peace and stability? Where are the entry points when working on conflict for this? And so in this case, we're also often trying to look at the economic routes to conflict. I mean, it's often said, I think one of the justifications for private sector development is that most, if not all, conflict has its roots in economic development, in that most conflict is based upon the need for income, the need, the scrabble, if you like, for resources and these kind of issues. So economic development is very important in terms of trying to get that change moving ahead. And in that sense, this notion of a virtuous cycle of reforms, where focusing on pragmatic constraints experienced by investors and business people would lead to returns, which would then, of course, feed the process of ongoing peace and stability. And I'll talk more about some of that in the coming slides. Thank you. Next slide. So within this, in terms of starting points, we're also asking about what are the sequencing of this? How do we determine what priorities exist in different stages of conflict or post-conflict, immediately after a conflict has occurred? And of course, here, what people are often saying is there's a real need to focus on the immediate needs of the private investors. This is domestic investors, people who are running small businesses, or maybe even informal businesses that are creating a livelihood, rather than these long-term development goals or aspirations. So, pragmatism and opportunistic reforms were often seen as more important. For example, the doing business reforms, doing business assessments were often seen as being far less relevant in these kind of situations, where it was often more about how to create the deal with immediate pragmatic problems that might exist. One of the areas that came up a lot in these discussions and the work that donors are doing is this notion of deals-based reforms, where rather than trying to say, what can we do to improve the whole business environment across the board, maybe what can be done is starting to focus on strategic investment opportunities, which can significantly create a change within the country. That might be in the energy sector or in telecoms or in finance or whatever it might be. But these would be strategically identified as strategically important. And then around that, where there is the opportunity for these interventions, the notion of trying to create reforms that respond to the needs, the pragmatic and opportunistic needs of those investment deal-based opportunities. Of course, public-private dialogue is seen as critical in a way of identifying reforms, monitoring how they're going and reporting back. It builds ownership, transparency, and confidence. Often, of course, there is the dialogue that exists between business and government is often not very, in these situations, is often not very inclusive. And so the push in this area is often to see what can be done to broaden the base of people who are involved in dialogue, to make sure it's far more representative, and in particular, more representative of the small business community and the domestic investors. And of course, within this, the notion of structured, evidence-based participatory is important. Thank you. Next slide, please. Another area of focus in this report is what we call here subnational business environment reform or local business environment reform. This is important because we are aware that fragility and conflict is not uniform usually across the country, that there are pockets or areas where it can be either worse or better. And often these local areas provide an opportunity to gain some traction with reforms. So typically in an area where there may be less conflict at the time, it might be create more opportunity for donors and their development partners to start looking at reforms, creating some progress and building some traction in those areas, and then looking for ways in which that could be expanded. Of course, the expansion of this has its own problems as well. In some cases, we have the notion of, can we replicate successful subnational reforms? Is it possible to repeat those reforms in other local jurisdictions around the country, even though they might, as we've identified them, because they are more stable, less fragility, it may be more difficult to transfer reforms from those kind of settings to ones where there is more instability and more fragility. Secondly, the issue around subnational reforms, where there has been success made, is can these be amplified? So rather than repeated elsewhere, can we learn lessons on the ground in a local area and then amplify that to a national level reform? And to varying degrees, in the report touches on some of the examples of that. Next slide, please. Of course, the notion of doing private sector development without doing harm is a sort of bottom line, if you like, with all of this. And this raises the importance of understanding what the root causes are to conflict and fragility, and at the very least ensuring that no harm is done. But here again, this notion of the nexus between PSD work, private sector development work, and the broader peacemaking humanitarian support, and the need to integrate that more. And this is where we come to this issue a bit about conflict assessments and the importance of those when starting to do programming, which comes on to our next slide, our last slide. Finally, what I've just done here is pull out some of the areas of advice for reformers that we hope would be particularly relevant for this discussion. Of course, the first one is to say that it's important to build trust amongst the parties that are involved. This can be done, as I mentioned before, through public-private dialogue, through broadening that base of who's involved in the dialogue and focusing on the pragmatic reforms. Avoiding macro-level interventions when violence is open and ongoing, rather focus on and reflect the needs of the private sector, and where that's possible to align that with the government political will is often seen as being more important. So again, that's another argument for saying, rather than the broad, macro, high-level, generic kind of reforms, to be more focused on the pragmatic problems that the private sector face, and of course, to align that with where there is political will. The point I haven't made so clearly, I think, in the last slide was invest in regular integrated conflict assessments. Many people said that agencies will do conflict assessments for their agency, but they're not always doing that for each of the programs that are supported. That it's very time consuming and can be very costly. But agencies have said that where that is done, where there is an integrated conflict assessment, one that starts to understand how the PSD program or the business environment reform program is linked to the diagnostic of peace and stability and the root causes, is very important. And I think that's one of the major messages that's come out of this, is the need to make that a stronger area of work. And then, of course, finally, integrating economic and business development programming with security and peacemaking, which was, as we started with, kind of one of the framing issues, that there is this need to ensure that they are more closely integrated and the opportunities for that are strengthened wherever possible. And the report talks about areas in which that can be done. So I think the last slide is simply a thank you, and I'll hand back to Séverine. Thank you very much, Séverine.
Thank you very much, Simon, for taking us quickly but slowly through this very rich report. I would like to remind participants, in case they have some questions, please do not hesitate. You have the Q&A box for that, and we will take questions afterwards. Simon gave us few insights and few advice for practitioners in his last slide, and without going through again the whole presentation, but opening very nicely for the next presenter, who is Julia, working at the GIZ and advising in the private sector development and employment promotion project in Iraq, and more specifically leading the team for economic transformation. And the project that Julia will talk about strengthens the capabilities of the Iraqi government to develop fact-based economic policies and strategies to improve economic policy conditions for a growth-oriented business and investment climate. And Julia will share with us some insights on this project in Iraq. What are the main activities, the challenges and the opportunities of working in such context. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Severin, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. Can we have the next slide, please? As Severin has already mentioned, I'm working for the private sector development and employment promotion from GIZ, which is a project that has been around since the end of 2017, commissioned by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And since the beginning of this year, we also have a significant contribution from the European Union. Our project has changed quite a lot since firstly being commissioned. We are now active in several parts in the country, Mosul, Erbil, Diyala, Diwania, Basra, and Baghdad. And the next slide, please. We mostly focus on Baghdad and Erbil when it comes to advisory and reforms, obviously. The project consists of two main components. One of them is improving the economic policy conditions for the growth-oriented business and investment climate, which then focuses on the regions Erbil and Baghdad. And the second component is focusing on employment promotion. The first component consists of three elements. On the one hand, this is economic policy advisory, basically like talking about economic transformation. We are working on business and investment climate improvement, as well as business integrity. The second component, as I said, focuses on employment promotion, so it's not that relevant, I'd say, for us today. We are working on youth capacity development, and SME development and business development service, as well as entrepreneurship and startup promotion and market innovations. Next slide, please. As you can imagine, Iraq has several challenges, and I'm trying to list those that are most relevant for the context. Obviously, the country has suffered massive destruction in the last decades, on the one hand, due to war and also to conflict with the Daesh, with the Islamic State. These conflicts have caused a massive number of refugees and IDPs in the country, leading to several problems, especially unemployment, but also infrastructure, water, education, as you can imagine. The security situation in the country, as well as in the entire region, is highly volatile, and Iraq is considered as one of the key states in the area, as it is a connection between Iran and Lebanon, but also very close to Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So the country is highly interesting for many donors trying to keep it stable and improving the current conditions. 90% of the state budget is depending on oil revenues, which in normal circumstances, meaning pre-COVID, usually was sufficient to generate enough income for the state to survive and provide the elite of the country, and especially the biggest cities in the country, with a fairly okay living. However, since the massive drop in oil prices and the COVID pandemic, this has significantly changed, since there is nothing else coming in terms of revenues, which is then enforcing a massive economic shock. The public sector is considered like the main employer in the country. That is obviously based on the history of the socialist state. It had been in the previous decades. However, this obviously causes several problems, one of which is that the very strongly growing labor force cannot be absorbed, especially considering the drop in revenues. Especially in the Kurdistan region, the public employees haven't been paid properly, meaning either fully or like really on a regular basis in the last few years. Still, it's considered a very safe workplace, and people do try to get in. So everyone is rather demonstrating to get a job, like demanding a job in the government, despite the fact that they know that they might not be paid, but at least they will have a job and they will have a pension in the end. The private sector is very, very poorly developed. One of the side effects is that there are a lack of property rights, and there is also a lack of sufficient infrastructure as well as opportunities. In theory, there is opportunity for funding, especially for startups and SMEs. However, this is always very difficult to actually for the companies to get this kind of funding. If you want to survive as a private company, most of them, they also depend highly on state contracts. Business in private, as we know it, is barely possible. One of the main challenges for us as a project who's trying to change that is that there's no clear mandate when it comes to reforms, and especially economic reforms. There are several actors like the Ministry of Planning, also the Prime Minister's Office, who have published plans and strategies for reforms in the last years. However, they don't seem to agree on who really is supposed to be in charge. So in the end, none of the plans are fully committed, especially when it comes to the legal aspect. Plans and laws do exist. However, many of them are not implemented, so then not effective at all. I've already mentioned the massive unemployment, especially among young people and females, and the electricity and water issue, especially in areas like in the south, in Basra. They have massive problems, especially this time of the year when you don't, where you really need electricity to survive the heat. With an air condition, that's barely possible. So the city looks as if the Islamic State has just left a couple of weeks ago, although there never have been in the area as well. The last point I've mentioned is probably one of the most important ones, though, which is the very high level of corruption. It's on 160th rank on Transparency International, and although there is corruption in most countries in this world, the countries have understood that you can take something from the pot, but you need to leave something in it so the system can run. However, in Iraq, sometimes it seems as if the whole pot is just being taken away, which makes then things very difficult for the government to actually function. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, our project has significantly changed in the last 3 years since it has been first established. And these changes, I think they also reflect not only the challenges, but also they reflect what we've learned. The biggest changes we've been through is budget. We've not sure if the new slide is already showing. For me, it's not, but in case you haven't changed it, it would be great if you could go to the next one. That would be the one with approaches. So yeah, the budget has been changing for us significantly, but most importantly, we've changed partners and approaches. We haven't done that because we didn't like the ones we were given in the first place, but one of the thank you very much. But one of the issues is that the political situation also is not particularly stable, so the actors are constantly changing, which then requires us to adapt, because mandates change and responsibilities change, and then in order to not completely stop our activities, we have now tried to have a bit more flexibility in working with several actors, and also trying to tackle many issues at the same time. So our approach now mainly consists of 3 elements. On the one hand, it's data and knowledge, it's networking and expertise, and the advisory. So what we do is we're trying to strengthen the capacities on the analytical side, but also when it comes to economic policy making with our political partners. And we also involve the private sector institutions, such as business associations, chambers of commerce, but also directly the private sector, starting from startups to SMEs. We're trying to improve the database in the country to actually enable fact-based policy making, and one of the approaches is, one of the concrete activities is to establish a business climate index. We are starting in Baghdad and Basra, and eventually are further developing this for the entire country. We are also trying to connect the stakeholders that are working on economic reforms. It's not like they haven't been talking before, but discussions and dialogue here are also difficult based on a lack of trust, especially between the private sector and the government. The third element, the advisory, is, I think, quite obvious. We try to support the partners with experts on a national but also international level in order to be able to supply the knowledge and the background they need for these specific projects they have. Next slide, please. And I've tried to highlight like the most important elements of our implementation. I think one of the most important ones really is the dialogue. We are setting up public-private dialogues, one of the most common tools used. However, we had to consider that this is not a priority for the Iraqi government. There is a lack of ownership or a willingness to take ownership and to push these things forward. So we are starting by building trust amongst stakeholders in smaller groups and smaller discussion rounds that are more technical and focusing when it comes to PPD really on a sectoral approach. So instead of going for the big platform directly, we now work, for instance, with the Ministry of Agriculture, together with the business associations for agriculture and engineers and farmers, who then work on topics related to the agricultural sector and agribusiness. We've also learned that not only a top-down, but also a bottom-up approach is needed, but at the same time, Iraq is a country that focuses very much on hierarchy. There's this one person, also based on its history, there's the one person who makes a decision, and this person needs to be involved in anything. So the Minister of Finance has to sign the leave request from any employee in a local bank in Basra, for instance. However, you need this top-down approach in order to get things moving on a larger scale. You also need the bottom-up approach in order to actually include the civil society, for instance. So we are trying to involve the civil society by giving them a voice. For instance, we're training journalists in economic reporting to enable the public discussion about economic discussion and especially about current economic topics. We're also fostering dialogues and again the topic of advocacy and exchanging with the government on a constructive level instead of just shouting at each other. The multi-actor approach, I've mentioned that in the beginning, is you cannot focus on one single actor, either on a political or on a private sector level. You basically need to, we have figured that we need to talk to as many people as available in order to actually move a little bit at a time. The needs, they change sometimes on a daily basis. So you have to have the flexibility in actually changing with those needs. And capacity building, I think it's quite obvious. It's the basis of what we do, because we take many things for granted, but very often, especially public institutions, but also the private sector institutions, they don't have the capacity to implement the ideas that we have. So in many stable countries, you can actually start like 3 steps further ahead, but in this fragile setting, you start from the very beginning. So in the end, I think the most important thing is a lot of patience, frustration, tolerance, and perseverance. You have to keep repeating yourself over and over again until somebody picks up your idea and does something with it. And I think I'm out of time, but I'm also finished. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions in a bit.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your presentation. And I mean, I make notes, of course, but indeed, I think what I heard at the end, I mean, flexibility, patience, perseverance, and I would add dedication. I think this is what the project shows is required to work in such an environment. Without waiting further so that we have time afterwards for exchange and discussion, I would like then to go to the next presentation, and we have 3 for the price of 1, I would say. So we are lucky to have 3 colleagues from the World Bank, and I will just introduce Sagita, who will then introduce her other 2 colleagues and co-presenters. Sagita is a senior private sector specialist with the World Bank Investment Climate Unit, and she works on business environment reform around the world, including in Afghanistan, where the project advised governments on how to improve legislation and administrative process to ease business operation and creation. So Sagita, please, the floor is yours, and I will ask you to introduce Tommaso and Suleiman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Severine. There are 3 of us today from the World Bank, since we've been working on several different fronts in the past few years in Afghanistan to improve the business environment. We will start with Tommaso Rooms, who works for our Subnational Doing Business team of the World Bank. This is one of the themes that also Simon brought up in his presentation, working at the subnational level. Tommaso and his team were involved in 2017 in collecting information on business regulations at the subnational level in Afghanistan. And so he will speak about the differences across the country among the subnational units, and the difficulties also of collecting this data in Afghanistan. And then we have Suleiman Akbari, who is our senior private sector specialist in Kabul, and he has been, in fact, leading the World Bank's business environment advisory support in Kabul in the past few years. And he's going to walk us through a little bit the type of support that we've been providing, some of the results that this work has had, and some of the lessons learned from our experience in Afghanistan. And I also wanted to point out that both of these initiatives were funded also by USAID, that's been supporting us in Afghanistan in the past few years. So since we're running a little bit out of time, we will start very quickly with Tommaso and then move on to Suleiman. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Sagita. So indeed, we published a subnational doing business report in Afghanistan back in March 2017. I won't spend too much time on the data themselves because some of them, as we will see in the second part of the presentation, are now outdated, but I think it's still worth providing some lessons learned and some difficulties that we encountered when implementing the project, and also some of the key findings that certainly still stand for the Afghan case. So I think you are, most of you are somehow familiar with doing business. There is a global doing business report that is published by the World Bank and measures and rank countries based in very short term on how easy it is for SMEs to deal with bureaucracy. Next to this global report, we also have subnational reports. These are done only upon the request of a donor, so they're not available for all countries. We did receive a request from USAID as part of a larger investment climate program to perform a subnational study in Afghanistan. What these subnational studies add to the global report is a measurement that goes beyond the main city. So global doing business measures one city as a proxy for the whole country. For Afghanistan, this is Kabul. With the subnational, we see if and where are the differences within the same country. The idea is that it's easier to start reforming by looking at what is already working within a country rather than looking at good practices from other places in the world that when extrapolated and replicated in a different context don't necessarily give the same results. So that's a bit the idea behind the project. In Afghanistan, what was interesting is that the ranking of the global doing business at the time was quite weak. Afghanistan was 183rd out of 180 countries, but most interesting is to see that it was low even compared to the fragile and conflict affected states as defined by the World Bank. The average rank for that group was 159. So there was a lot of room for improvement, even considering all the security issues that Afghanistan was and is facing. Basically, in all the areas measured by doing business, only in 2 of them, Afghanistan was ranking better than the average fragile and conflict-affected states. And these were indeed the 2 areas where most of the reforms concentrated by at that time. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So indeed, we measured 4 additional cities compared to Kabul. These are Balkh, Nangarhar, Kandahar, and Herat. We looked at a subset of the doing business indicators. Basically, we selected those that were likely to show a variation at the subnational level, which are starting a business, dealing with construction permits, getting electricity, and registering property. I think that the 2 main results of the study are on one side, putting on the map additional cities than Kabul. When we started, we knew that there was an abundance of data regarding Kabul, but when you move outside in the other provinces, data dramatically lacking, especially in the business environment area. So the first thing was to give a picture of the situation of how things were at the subnational level. The second thing, and we can move to the next slide, is that in many areas, actually, Kabul was performing better than the rest of the cities, especially when it comes to how you open up the process of opening a business or connecting to the grid. And this is because in many areas, including these two, most of the reforms somehow they stopped in the capital. So even if on paper they where at the national basis, in practice, and what we looked at, it's also not only the laws, but also the implementation of the law. Outside of the capital, they remain on paper. So, and on the other side, for some of the processes, any entrepreneur in the country needed to do part of the process in the capital. So that was clearly a disadvantage from whoever was not based in Kabul. On the other side, in some areas, we actually, and especially in those areas where local authorities had played a bigger, most important role, we noticed that there were things that the provinces could solution that were working better than in Kabul, and this was particularly the case for dealing with construction permits or registering property, where some pilots were implemented in cities other than Kabul. So basically, the results that captured the attention of the government and of the donor was that Kabul, Afghanistan, as represented by Kabul in the Doing Business 2017 ranking, was 186. An hypothetical city that benched together all the good practices that we found at the local level would have ranked 172. So 11 position above of what was at the time the ranking for Afghanistan. And this is a huge jump for, especially in doing business terms, especially for a country at the bottom of the ranking. And we can move to the last slide, just to share some of the challenges that we faced. The security situation deteriorated from when we start the process to the project to when we finished it. So we had to adapt a lot to the new risks. We had limits to for movement, which is a big limit when you work at the subnational level. Public available information were very limited. Some local authorities didn't want to share too much information with us. So what was key for us was the presence of the World Bank as an office in Kabul, with experts in all of the area that we were measuring. So that was a key element to first of all, to get the information, to be in touch with the people that will provide us with the data, and also to have a dialogue with these colleagues. We also worked with several partners external to the World Bank in the country to collect the information. We increased the timeline, the number of contributors that we would normally have in for subnational doing business studies, and we try to do as much face-to-face data collection as we could, including meeting with all the local authorities involved in the 4 areas, so to explain them what we were doing and to get the information that we needed. With this, I will leave the mic to Suleiman, and I'm happy to answer any question you might have later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. So basically, just giving you a perspective of the country, the key challenges for Afghanistan's economic growth. The poverty, half of the population are living below the poverty line. Unemployment is significantly high. The economy, which took off after the fall of the Taliban, basically contracted soon after the withdrawal. Corruption, as in the case of Iraq, is extremely high. in the country. And similarly, with the high level of political uncertainty and stability, it really takes a huge toll on the reforms. Talking specifically about the role of private sector, as Simon mentioned in his presentation, private sector in a fragile context can foster stability, peace, and social cohesion. So role of private sector becomes extremely important. However, private sector is constrained by an unconducive business climate. Afghanistan used to rank, when we started our engagement, it was at the bottom of the doing business report, which obviously, of course, I mean, has its own limitations, but basically it showed us where the country stands in terms of the investment climate. Infrastructure-wise, the country lacks access to land, reliable energy, and enabling services to the private sector. Similarly, in case of trade, the country is very much dependent on imports, and probably this is something that makes us Afghanistan stand out among the FCAS countries as well. The amount of dependence which we have on imports. Financial sector, talking about the financial sector, low public confidence, fragile financial stability, deficient infrastructure, the amount of the transactions and the ownership of the bank account is extremely high, extremely low comparing to other FCD countries. So this is basically a broader context of where the country stands. Next slide, please. And definitely to make the country address some of these constraints, there was significant scope to work. We started basically addressing some of these issues and engaging with the government to tackle these problems. We provided under the project the hands-on support to the government of Afghanistan to draft their national priority program for development of the private sector. We try to make the recommendations as practical and pragmatic as possible, because what happens in countries like Afghanistan, and you have many priorities and conflicting priorities, and sometimes resources are constrained. So we try to focus on pragmatic solutions to the problems that have the highest impact. Similarly, we drafted the Doing Business Reform Memorandum. This became a roadmap for countries' development of the not just the Doing Business report, but also the overall investment climate. And this became the roadmap for improvement of Afghanistan's investment climate overall. We provided hands-on support to drafting the legal documents, such as the limited liability company law, the insolvency law, and these laws later helped the country to improve its ranking in the Doing Business report. Most importantly, what we did, because what happens in fragile countries, political will is really key and important. So here we made sure that the reforms have the backing from the highest political level possible. And this led to establishment of an interministerial coordination committee on private sector development, the roadmap of which was the private sector national priority program. And this was chaired by the first vice president of the country. This led to significant improvement of Afghanistan's investment climate and some of the major constraints to business in Afghanistan. Next slide, please. So, yeah, thank you. These reforms led to significant improvements in Afghanistan's doing business. As I mentioned, Afghanistan used to be one of the lowest ranked countries in doing business report. But the reforms that were undertaken with the support from the project that was funded by the USAID led to improvements in 5 indicators. Starting a business, basically the cost of a business was brought down and the processes were simplified. Getting credit with the insolvency law that we provided support to the government became easier, and secured creditors were given absolute priority over the claims with insolvency proceedings. Similarly, with protecting minority, the country made a huge jump from a score of 10 to 71 because of the revisions in the amendments to the law. On paying taxes, which is considered one of the biggest constraints for Afghanistan when it comes to investment climate, the country adopted a new tax administration and law manuals with which it lays out the clear rules and guidance on tax audit and automated submission of tax returns. We started basically the rollout of automated tax filing from the large tier taxpayer office, which is considerably lower than the medium and small, and over time, learning from the experiences rolled it out to the medium and small taxpayers as well. And similarly with the resolving insolvency, the country made a jump from the doing business score of 23 to 51 in the doing business report. This basically showed us that despite the situation that I explained earlier, the uncertainty, the various other issues, reforms were possible if they're political will and if the countries focus on the right set of issues. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another project that we worked on was the business licensing project. Of course, business incorporation was extremely difficult in Afghanistan with multiple licensing entities, sometimes overlaps and differences in procedures between Kabul and provinces. As Tommaso mentioned in his presentation earlier, licensing was one of the binding constraints. This project, I believe, is also one very good project that shows how the donors can collaborate. So you can see the picture on the left and the one on the right. We collaborated very closely with the DFID funded project. They constructed the building while we worked on process simplification and building and basically procuring and enabling technology. In case of the business licensing project, now Afghanistan has the highest score in South Asia, a score of 92 in the Doing Business report. We established a one-stop shop and our intervention led to removal of all parallel entities that issued licenses. We helped the country to establish a modern data center. This helped basically connect the capital city Kabul with the other provinces. And that really helped us to improve the business and cooperation, not just in capital, but also in other provinces. The issues were highlighted in the subnational report, so that basically our intervention tried to address those as well. Similarly, what we also noticed that these interventions led to formalization and encourages formalization. Although the situation in the country deteriorated significantly between 2015 and 21, but we believe the simplification and licensing led to a more formalization of businesses in the country. And last but not the least, streamlining the licensing procedures led to cost saving for the private sector as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what we learned from these interventions in the country was that political will has no substitute. We really want to we really want the backing of other political actors who are involved in the process, not just the top down, but also bottom up as well. What helped us the most was to provide hands-on support, donor community, given the high dependence of country on aid, have the leverage as well to work on business enabling reforms. And we do have the leverage to be in the kitchen and provide that support to the government of Afghanistan. And that really helped us to improve the situation. Public-private dialogue, as mentioned in the earlier presentations, plays an important role. And here we relied on developing these documents, we relied a lot on the consultation and inclusive consultation of the private sector. Partnerships, of course, matter. The partnership between the donor agencies and the partnership between the private sector really is important. What we also learned is that working in fragile countries does require flexibilities in designing of the projects. it also requires the the flexibility to go beyond the typical timelines you have for other advisory projects. So in some of our projects, it took us longer than we had initially expected, but it was important in order to make the project sustainable. And because real changes and really require time, and we need to allow that time. Sustainability is important, and therefore, although in our projects we did rely on consultants and consulting firms, but we tried to include the government to do their work, and our role was to help the governments improve and not just providing everything by our experts. Let me stop it here and give it the floor back to Sagita. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suleiman and Tommaso. I'm not going to delay it any longer. We're a little bit over time already, but I think one extra point that I wanted to mention is that this business environment support in Afghanistan from the World Bank has used almost all the type of instruments that the bank has at its disposal. So apart from the data gathering that Tommaso mentioned and the advisory support that Suleiman mentioned, we also used to push the government through the Afghanistan Incentives Program, which is a development policy grant that supports the government financially based on policy reforms. And some of the legal reforms that Suleiman mentioned, including the insolvency law, were included in that program to provide more incentive for the government to adopt the changes in legislation. Finally, there's also an ongoing investment financing grant that, among many other things, is supporting some of the local governments to improve the construction permitting process based on the subnational data that Tommaso spoke about. So there was also a follow-up to that data. It wasn't just about collecting it and providing the baseline, but also there's other instruments of the bank that are using that to support local governments to improve those processes. So that's been very useful. So I think it's a key feature of this engagement that we've used so many different instruments to push for the business environment reform agenda. So thanks a lot. So that's all from the World Bank, and we can jump right into questions.
Thank you very much to the presentations and our panelists. I see that a very genuine but a little bit provocative question that has been asked by Jacinto Fabiosa. So if we can, Ella, can we give the floor to participants so that they can raise their comments in the 15 minutes that we have remaining? And if that's the case, I would give the floor to Jacinto. Yeah. Jacinto, do you want to share your interrogation on where the money is going?
Am I unmuted?
We can hear you.
Okay, so I saw in one of the data that the financial sector allocated 22% of the deposit to credit to the private sector. I wonder where the other 78% went. How much of it went to credit to the government, and where else did the financial sector allocate the remainder of the deposit? Thank you.
Can you just let us know from which organization you are?
I'm with USAID in Washington, D.C. with the Center for Economics and Market Development.
Great, thank you very much. So can we have a response to this interesting question?
Suleiman, do you want to take that?
Suleiman, you're muted in case you try to. Okay, not working. Okay, let me know when you can
hear me now?
Ah, yeah. Okay, good. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So one of the things about Afghanistan, and you may have heard the financial, the collapse of one of the largest commercial banks in 2010, the Kabul bank crisis. One of the banks collapsed and basically defaulted by almost $1 billion. So that really hurted the confidence in the banking sector. Now the banks are extremely liquid, but unfortunately, because of the high risk profile in the country, the types of control they have introduced in the country are extremely high, and that leads to little lending to the private sector. The level of checks and balances that they have to go through are huge, and that becomes a barrier by itself. Some of the instruments we are using at the bank is to provide credit guarantees, so to minimize the risks to the government, to the banks, in order to improve lending to the private sector. But that's one of the challenges that the country is faced with. I hope I've answered the question. Apologies for the glitch in the system.
No, thank you very much. And in case Jacinto still wants more information, I mean, he can ask on the chat. I would now like to turn to another kind of questions, which is actually very close to my heart, as I work for the ILO, but doesn't come from me initially. So it comes from participants that have expressed some questions before the seminar. And the question is about international labor standards. I understand, Margaret, that comes from you. The question is, what role international labor standards can play in business environment reform? So maybe, Margaret, you want to expand a little bit on your question, and then I will ask Simon, and then Julia and one of the Afghanistan presenter to reflect on that question.
Thank you. Severin, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Good
afternoon, everyone. This is Margaret. I'm sitting in Kabul at the moment, pretty much in isolation because I managed to catch COVID, but I'm otherwise okay. You know, in when we talk about the private sector, we tend to see business owners really in their role as entrepreneurs, but not necessarily in their role as employers and, you know, with workers as such important dialogue partners. And obviously, international labor standards for me are important. And I know that oftentimes when people hear, oh my God, international labor standards, that's going to cost us, you know, everything. But in terms of, you know, fragile environments like this, where it is so important for, and someone talked about productivity. I think it was Simon White that talked about issues of productivity. You know, how important do you see the role of workers and their organizations, as weak as they might be in these fragile environments, as really key partners in business environment reform, and especially in that transition, you know, from a war economy to a peace economy? And here I'm also drawing from the ILO's project up in Balkan Samangan, which is using market system development approaches, but really also looking at how, you know, some of the normative elements can be really applied in mainly micro and small enterprises, so that the workers' situation is improved and therefore productivity is improved. So really looking at the business environment from the role of entrepreneurs as employers and in their dialogue with workers. Sorry for taking a bit of time. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Simon.
Yes, thanks, Margaret. Nice to hear from you. I'm glad to know that you're not sick, even though you're in isolation. Yeah, look, it's a great point. And I'm aware, of course, that the ILO talks a lot around social dialogue in terms of government, employers, and employees. And we haven't talked about that so much. Instead, we've talked about PPD, public-private dialogue, which is business and government. And I think you've really raised this important question about workers and international labor standards. And I think the the issue that I've seen in the report that I was doing and another work, I guess, is that, there's a very large informal sector in many of these countries. Obviously, in some cases, the crisis has driven or expanded the informal economy. And so you do find a lot of people who are own account workers, people who are not necessarily contracted workers being paid award wages under social protection schemes and all the things that make decent work. So when I talked before about broadening out the public-private dialogue, that was very much to include people who would otherwise be excluded from that. And as I mentioned, what I think we've often seen is typically big business in dialogue with government on a fairly regular, if not formal or informal basis. But often in these situations, we're talking about certainly continuing that, broadening that, getting more people involved in that, and also working then with associations, organizations that might represent the self-employed, the own account workers, and the broader range of workers in the informal economy only, many of whom are missed out by labor laws if they're applied in these situations in any case. So I think, it would be hard to talk about, how do you then start to apply all the international labor standards in these kind of settings? But I think the entry point is about broadening dialogue, ensuring that these workers, whether in the informal sector or in the formal sector, are represented better and represented in this dialogue that has meaning. And I think finally, I would just come back to a point that I labored a little in my presentation, which was around this notion of pragmatic reforms and ensuring that reforms are focused on the kinds of issues that come up in this dialogue, and that they are addressing the kinds of problems that workers in the informal economy, that own account workers and small micro enterprises, the kinds of issues that they might face. So I hope that it helps to address some of that, Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Talking about pragmatic needs, I think, Julia, that was also your words in your presentation. So yeah, labor standards, how did you handle that? Was it something you looked at?
Yeah, I wish I had an answer on how to really set it up and implement it. I think actually it's one of the reasons why, or the lack of rights for laborers is why people, especially in Iraq, rather work in the public sector than in the private sector, because at least they do have a little bit of rights, and they do have a pension, they are protected. In the private sector, and especially in the informal sector, as Simon has mentioned, they are not protected at all. In theory, there are laws, but they're not enforced, and they're not well known. So one of the points that I consider really important is making people aware of their rights, of the existing labor laws and international standards. And by raising awareness on that, really creating a demand, and also putting the private sector companies, startups, as well as SMEs and large companies, putting them under pressure in, so they actually have to apply those rules also in the private sector. And this would make a huge difference, because the private sector then gets a lot more attractive for people, especially young people, to pursue their career in it, because they don't have to be afraid, and they know they have even better chances than in the public sector. So yes, the communication, the dialogue is one of the most essential parts in this. But I think the government again has to be on, like, it, they have to contribute by just enforcing the laws, by setting up controls, checking the private sector to actually apply the laws, etc. Thank you.
Sagita, making the private sector an attractive employer in a country like Afghanistan. So
yeah. So, I mean, it's true. We also never really focus too much in our work on labor standards, but I think one of the channels through which this, this work contributes is, as Simon said, by working to formalize as much as possible of the informal firms, right? You can't talk about labor standards if many firms are informal. You can't even talk about, you can't even start talking about the enforcement of those standards if many firms are informal. So I think that is how we would contribute to this, right? By trying to formalize as many firms as possible. And one of the reasons why many firms are informal is the startup, the difficult startup process, as well as the tax administration, right? So I think some of the areas that we focused were, as Suleiman mentioned, these two areas, to make it as simple as possible for businesses to be able to function formally and register with the government. And then you can start talking about how to enforce some of the labor standards, which of course there is economic rationale there that are important for productivity. Yeah.
Thank you, Sagita. I would like to take another question, if time allows, and we still have 9 minutes left. And the next question is about conflict analysis, right? So Simon, you mentioned, I think, that there needs to be some conflict assessment done to inform the decision making. Julia, you also mentioned having some conflict assessment right in your activities, and of course also the Afghan project has also informed was also informed by data collection, etc. So the question, and I would like first to ask Julia, and is how is conflict analysis used to identify entry points for investors? And yes, I will start with Julia, and then again, I think that's interesting for all the panelists. So I will then go to Simon before going to Afghanistan. Thank you.
What we do is we do a conflict and risk analysis when setting up a new project within GIZ. So that's a major part when setting up new project and also renewing and changing them. So we do keep this like I said, a major part of the project itself. However, we don't particularly use it for investments unless the project focuses itself on investments. So what we do though is we try to find the stakeholders that are relevant for us here in Iraq. It's like the National Investment Committee or like the legal counterparts and address those issues. Yeah, that would be it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Simon, conflict assessment.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, just briefly on this, I guess I would say my first point earlier was that what I found in the research that I did was that there were agencies that did conflict analysis for their agency, which covered all the programs that they were supporting and all the kind of activities. And these might be done every 2 years or maybe even every year. And they were very general, and they didn't necessarily connect with the program design itself. And that was often seen as a problem. I think what Julia has talked about is certainly a good practice in terms of the agencies like GIZ, where these might be done at the beginning of the program to identify risks, of course, and usually many agencies go into this risk management mitigation type activity anyway, but not necessarily conflict assessments in that way. And it's good to hear that GIZ is doing that as the programs are being set up. Most of the people that I spoke to, which included GIZ, and I think what was very interesting was they said, well, these a set of agencies were saying they found that the conflict assessments were typically being done in an informal way with business people on a regular basis. So as they were going out into the field talking, they often got more information about the conflict that was going on, about some of the issues that could be addressed. and trying to be, again, pragmatic and opportunistic in terms of how they focus the programs. And in a sense, what many people told me was that this kind of regular dialogue, regular engagement with business people gave them more useful information about the conflict at the time, the kinds of areas where they should be refocusing their program than any formal conflict assessment had done in the past. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I'm calling them the Afghan crew, but I give you the floor.
Well, I mean, I think there is a sort of, we don't really do conflict assessment so much at the level of the project. It's more done at the level of the World Bank as part of, you know, the discussions on what should the bank support in these countries. So I think that's where it's done. But obviously, there's a lot of conversations that happen with the private sector as part of the project preparation to find out exactly what their issues are and how they linked to the conflict, right? But Suleiman, please go ahead and add.
Thank you. So yes, Sakita, at the country level, we do this assessments. The CPF, for example, the country partnership framework. We do see what's realistic and what's not. And even as we speak right now, and the situation in the country is getting worse day by day, we have this scenario analysis where we lay out the expectations, the optimistic, the more of a realistic situation, and more of a pessimistic situation. So this is done at the country level. At the project level, every reporting cycle, we do look into some of the risks that are involved. That includes the conflict and situation. And in case of countries like Afghanistan, it's not just the conflict, but also the associated uncertainties with the conflict. So this is another layer that we evaluate every 6 months. But Simon, I do agree with you that the interaction with the business community does bring a lot of insight as well. And when I mentioned this this executive committee, the interministerial committee we've helped the government to establish at a very high level, the way they function. So they have the working groups that meet every month. They discuss the issues, and in those working groups, and most of these working groups, they have the private sector as the co-chair, who sit together with the government, chair the potential reforms that needs to be undertaken by the government. So they do benefit from those sort of feedback that feeds into it, and then the working groups, reported higher and higher, and that over time influences the policy decisions of the government and the reform agenda of the government. Hope I've clarified it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I see that one participant would like to share something, and that will be the last question and comment, if it can be short. Yuka, can you please take the floor? Please unmute yourself. And we will then finalize this webinar. Yuka? We don't hear you.
Hello, this is Yuka from JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. Sorry, it was a long sign. Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand. Sorry, I'm very sorry about that.
No problem. So at least we heard your voice. Thank you so much. So we are now rounding up this webinar, and I would like to thank very much Ella and Jim for organizing and for hosting us for this webinar. Simon for, of course, organizing it as the coordinator of the working group, and for all the presenters. And just to leave us with some final advice, I will ask each of the speakers one word that would summarize your advice for donors that want to conduct business environment reform in fragile and conflict-affected setting. And I will go in order of speaking. So Simon, Julia, Sagita, Tommaso, and Suleiman. Thanks.
One word.
Yes.
Pragmatic. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I think I go for donor coordination.
Okay, I'm
two.
going to go for long-term support.
That's two, but that's okay.
Long-term.
I wanted to say coordination as well, but this got stolen, so I would say data.
And I would say be patient. Real reforms take time. I know so many words, but
Thank you so much for this advice. So we just need to take that into account. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.